Hello, my name is Ariel Rokem, and I'm a data scientist at the University of Washington. Welcome to this OHBM educational course about deep learning for human brain mapping. In this course, you'll see applications of deep learning techniques to understand and analyze human brain data. But first, this lecture will provide an introduction to deep learning. The slides for this lecture are at this URL, so if you'd like to follow along with the slides, or if you'd like to check out the slides after the lecture, you can go to this link, aerokem.github.io/conv-nets-slides to see these slides. This lecture will provide a bit of an introduction to ideas behind deep learning. So if you're familiar with deep learning, you might want to skip this lecture altogether. But if you're not familiar, then this lecture will provide a general introduction, and then I will walk you through some code that will help you understand how deep learning works. But first, let me introduce the topic in general. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning. Machine learning are a set of techniques, a set of statistical and computational techniques that are used to learn from data. The idea is that features of the data are extracted or engineered in some fashion, and then a set of training data is used to infer certain model parameters. For example, the features might be the intensities of pixel values in an MRI, a brain MRI image. And then the model might be a model that tells us whether that brain MRI image is taken from the brain of a person with a certain disease or from a healthy person. The training data is used in order to infer the model parameters that connect the values of the pixels to the decision, whether that person has the disease or not. So a set of training data is used in order to create the model. And then another separate test data is used to evaluate the accuracy of the model. This principle, called cross-validation, is important in order to make sure that the model is fit to features of the data, to aspects of the data that are conserved, and not overfit to noise that exists only in the training data. As I said, artificial neural networks are a subset of machine learning. They're a family of machine learning algorithms that includes deep learning algorithms. And they're inspired by biology. As the name suggests, artificial neural networks are designed to be in some way similar to our neural networks. Here's an image from the book in the 1960s by Minsky and Papert that sort of exemplifies that. You can see that this neural network is somehow sensing the environment and then integrates the data into some kind of a decision over here. Here's a more modern image of that from a recent review from Jan LeCun and others. Here what you see is the architecture of a neural network. The architecture is such that there are units at the bottom that we think of as input units. You may think of these as, say, the values of the pixels in the image, and then those values are then propagated forward into hidden units in a first layer. So each unit here receives its inputs from these inputs, and then a second hidden layer, a layer of more units that receive their inputs from the first hidden units, and then a set of output units at the top that can decide for us, for example, is this a brain of a person with a certain disease, or is this a healthy brain? Now the question is, how do we learn the parameters, the weights that define the connections between the input layers and the first hidden layer and between subsequent hidden layers, and ultimately between the last hidden layer and the output layer? The main algorithm that is used in deep learning and in neural networks more generally is an algorithm called backpropagation. The idea is that we can look at the output of the network at any given point in time, and we can see how do we need to adjust the weights in here in order to reduce the error at that point in time. Now, if we're looking at the weights of the decision units or the output units at the very top, then there's a direct connection. When you change the weight here, it directly affects the decision that you're making and directly affects the cost function. But to change the units within the network, in the hidden layers and the connections between them, we need some kind of a daemon that will go in and to change the weights. And that daemon is backpropagation, is an algorithm that I'll describe now, and I'll show you in some code in just a little bit. So for the top layer, the output layer, as I said, we might ask, how would the error change if we change the activity in each unit just a little bit? And for layer L-1 within the network, in the hidden layers, we might ask how much would change in each weight affect the activity in the subsequent layer L. Now, how activity changes in layer L depends on activity in layer L-1 and the weights between them in the following way. It depends, first of all, on how active is the node feeding into the particular weight that we are interested in changing. It depends on how the change in the weight would affect the output of the node that it feeds into. And then finally, it depends on the activity of the node and how the activity is affecting the error. So it depends on 3 different factors. And we need to take into account these 3 factors when we change the weight to improve the error. And this is called backpropagation. And I'll show you this in detail in some code in just a little bit. But keep this in mind. Now, in modern deep learning, we use also a trick that we call stochastic gradient descent. The idea is we'd like to change the weights gradually in order to reach the ultimate value of the weights in the network so that the network is a good network. So in order to do this, we choose a random batch of data from our training data, and we calculate the errors from the top of the network back, adjusting the weights by a small amount in every round. And we repeat this again and again and again. This is called stochastic gradient descent because of the random selection of a batch from the training data in every round. Now we repeat this process until the process converges, until the error doesn't change anymore, and then we stop the process. Here's a graphic that exemplifies this. For example, we initialize here's a network, and each axis here, the x-axis is one weight and the y-axis is another weight. And for the purpose of a demonstration here, we'll only have 2 weights for this network because it's simpler to show, but imagine that we have multiple weights. We have many weights in this kind of network. But let's just look at these 2 weights, and for the values of these 2 weights, the error before we started this is some value, 0.7146, and our weights are initially randomly selected to be these values in this point up here. So in the first round, we feed it some data, and we adjust the error to go over to this point over here, and then we go 10 more epochs, and the error reduces by going over here, and we continue to do that 40 epochs, 50 epochs, and the error keeps going down and down and down until we reach an area of this error surface that has low error, and at this point the algorithm starts to converge. The weights change very little, and at some point we decide that the error isn't going to change anymore, and we stop it. So that's the general mechanism of learning in artificial neural networks. Next, what I'll talk about are so-called convolutional neural networks. Convolutional neural networks are a very important development in neural networks that are designed for computer vision. Computer vision in general are algorithms that analyze images, and these are particularly important for us in neuroimaging. Convolutional neural networks are inspired specifically, again, by our visual system. So here's an image from neuroscience work on the visual system. This is the visual cortex of a ferret. And what you see here are domains within the visual cortex that are active when a particular orientation of the bar is shown. You can see that different parts of the visual cortex are active to create this kind of pinwheel formation. Now, another way to think of this is that in every point in space, there are some detectors that detect a particular orientation. And this kind of formation capitalizes on the fact that nearby points in the image are often spatially correlated. Another way to think of this is that we are convolving the image with the filter that has a particular orientation. So this is a convolution operation. You see here, at the bottom here is the image, and then you can think of a filter with 3 by 3 pixels that has a certain sensitivity to a particular feature that is convolved with this to create up here in green what we call a feature map. So this feature map represents the presence of a particular feature represented by this filter in every point in the image. And this is the principle behind convolutional neural networks. Let me show this, demonstrate this in a particular specific image. So here we have this image in grayscale of a wall and has all kinds of features in it. Let's say that we have a filter that is organized in the following way. It has 3 by 3 pixels, and it has negative 0.5, negative 0.5, negative 0.5 in the first row, 1, 1, 1 in the second row, and negative 0.5, negative 0.5, negative 0.5 in the third row. So this filter, when convolved with this image, emphasizes in particular the horizontal features in this image. If in contrast, we take and we rotate this kernel, we call this filter also a kernel, we rotate this kernel by 90 degrees, we instead get a feature map that emphasizes in particular the vertical features of this image. So these kinds of filters can be learned from the image, and this is what deep learning does. It learns these filters, these feature extractors from images that it receives in the training data. And we'll see the mechanics of that in code in just a little bit. These kind of convolutional neural networks have been really, really important in computer vision. Really, the point at which this became very important is in 2012 in this paper by Krzyzewski et al., where they demonstrated in a very large data set of natural images that these kind of convolutional neural networks can reach very high accuracy in classifying images into 1,000 different categories of natural objects. And you can see that the images are very, very variable. This image has a motor scooter in it, but it has many different things. And the motor scooter appears in the corner of the image, not centered into the image. So these convolutional neural networks are very good at detecting images, even in the face of a lot of variance in the location of the object that they're trying to identify and the orientation from which this object is taken. Deep learning has also now made its way into analysis of brain imaging data, and you'll hear a lot of examples in a following lecture. I'd like to just give a simple example first for you to kind of understand, and this is from work that Anisha Keshavan did when she was a postdoc with me at UW Science. She's since then moved on to the Child Mind Institute and recently into industry in a company called Octave Biosciences, where she's applying similar ideas into their applications. And this is work that we did together with Jason Yateman, who was at the UW at the time and has since moved on to Stanford. And in this work, we were interested in building a neural network that can do MRI quality control. So MRI quality control is a really difficult computer vision problem. It's really important to us because the quality of MRI images is a major bottleneck in our analysis. Take, for example, these images from the Healthy Brain Network data set. These are T1 weighted MRI images of the brains of children in the scanner. And children tend to move in the scanner. So in some cases, the images are quite good. But in other images, in other cases, they have a lot of artifacts in them. And we'd like to build a neural network that can do this discrimination. It's important to build a neural network algorithm for this because the kinds of features that appear in images that don't have good quality can be very, very variable depending on exactly what happened during the scan, whether the child moved or there was some other kind of artifact. So the artifacts are highly variable, and it's actually very hard to do this task with standard computer vision. And so we build a neural network to do this. It's a bit of a long story, which I won't tell you here in full, but I'll just mention that it's in a paper in 2019 in Frontiers in Neuroinformatics that you can find. And I'll just summarize our results. We trained a neural network based on the classifications that we got from a crowd of citizen scientists who rated images from the data set in a web app called Braindr. And we compared the performance of this neural network that we trained to the performance of neuroimaging experts who painstakingly looked through many, many slices of a subset of the original data set. And our neural network, this deep learning neural network, reached a very, very high accuracy. So deep learning can perform this task at very, very high accuracy if you provide it with enough data, which in this case was provided by citizen scientists that rated brain images. Okay, how did we do this? Let me show you some code now, and we'll walk through code that will explain how neural networks work, and then it'll show you a little bit of an example that Anisha designed with some actual neural data. The demo will make use of a Jupyter notebook in the collaboratory environment, In order to reach that, you'll need to use this link down here. So it's bit.ly/OHBM-DL-2020-intro. Let me copy this link into a new tab here, and I'll go to that link, and it'll open this interface that you see here. This is the collaboratory notebook. Before you get started, what I'll ask you to do is go to the File menu up here and save a copy in Drive. Click on Save a Copy in Drive. This should make a copy in your Google Drive of this, and then we'll work inside of this copy. So it'll say copy of this notebook. And before we get started, what I'll ask you to do is go to this runtime menu and click on Change Runtime Type, and make sure that the hardware accelerator here is set to GPU. So we'll need to use a graphical processing unit, a hardware accelerator in here for the code to run sufficiently fast. I'm gonna save that and go ahead. So the code into this notebook is written in the Python programming language, and I'll go this rather quickly. You can explore this notebook in a lot of detail on your own. These notebooks, the way they work is that there are cells where you can write text. This is a markdown cell, and you can execute that with by typing Shift and then the return key. So the notebook is executed, every cell in the notebook is executed by typing Shift and return. This here is a code cell. This code cell downloads some scripts that we need in order to run subsequent code. So we'll run that. While the code is executing, you'll see this dashed line around the play button. That means that the code is executing. Okay, when it's done executing, it will receive a number here, and we go on to this next cell. Here in this cell, we're importing a few code components that we'll need in order to execute code in subsequent cells. Okay, so having done that, let's start with neural networks and how they work. So we'll start with a very, very simple neural network. This is as simple a neural network as you can imagine, pretty much. This neural network has, at the bottom here, 2 input units. The way that units in a neural network are designated is we say that the activity in this input unit is x11, and the subscript 1, the first subscript 1 refers to the layer that this unit belongs to, and the second subscript refers to the index within that layer. So this unit is unit x11, and this unit here is x12, so it's the second unit in the first layer. These 2 units feed into an output unit. This output unit is designated x21. So it's the first unit in the second layer in this network. And the weight that connects x11 to x21 is designated W superscript 211. So the superscript here designates the layer that this weight is feeding into. You'll see that this weight here that connects x12 to x21 is designated as W superscript 212. So the subscript here designates which unit this weight belongs to. So which unit this weight goes into, and which unit this weight goes from. So 12 means go from this W superscript 2 subscript 12 means this is the weight into layer 2 from the second unit to the first unit in layer number 2. Let's write this in code. So the computation that this unit here does is x21 equals x11 times W superscript 2 subscript 11 plus x12 W superscript 221. So the output unit does a linear summation over its inputs. Implemented in code, we initialize, let's say that the activity in x11 is 1 and the activity in x12 is 2. And let's say that we've chosen some weights. W211 is -2 and W221 is 3. We initialize these variables, and then we compute the linear sum of the inputs into the value of the output. So in this case, the value of the output, x21, is 4. So the result of this computation is 4. More generally, we can think of this operation here as a dot product. So this is a dot product of the weights into layer 2 with the activity in layer 1. Here we've written this out in NumPy and in code. So we have the vector of the weights from layer 1 to layer 2, and the vector of the activities in layer 1, and we take a dot product between them, and we can see that the result of this dot product is exactly the same as this operation here. We've just written this as a dot product. Okay, so this is a very simple neural network. Let's make this neural network slightly more complicated by adding a hidden layer. So now we have two input units in the input layer, and we have two hidden units in the hidden layer, and then one output unit. Now you can see that between the input layer and the hidden layer, there are actually 4 weights, because every unit in the input layer impinges on every unit in the hidden layer. So for example, W211 is the weight from X11 to X21, and then W212 is the weight from X12 here onto X21. And there's the same 2 weights for one from the first unit onto this unit, and one from the second unit onto this second unit. So in total, we have 4 weights between layer 1 and layer 2, the hidden layer, and then we have 2 weights as before between layer 2, between the hidden layer and this output layer. Let's write all these units out. So we receive the activities from the input layers, that's X11 and X12, as before it's 1 and 2. And then we set the weights, these weights, W211, W221, W212, and W222 are the weights between the input layer and the first hidden layer. And then W311 and W321 are the weights between the hidden layer and the output layer. Now, in order to compute the full activity in this network, we need to do 3 dot products. One is a dot product for this unit over here. One dot product is for this unit over here. And then once we've done these 2 dot products, we can do a dot product for this unit over here. So these first 2 dot products compute the activity in the hidden layer, and then this dot product over here computes the activity in the output layer. Okay. Now you'll notice that these are fully linear so far, and so there's a limit to the kinds of elaborate computations that you can do with these linear units. But things get a lot more interesting if we add activation functions, so-called activation functions, into each unit. So now we've rewritten this network that I had before, but you'll notice that I've added a little f of x21 and f of x22, and then f of x31 into here, into these units. And that means that the activity in the unit is then passed through some kind of an activation function. And different functions can be used. Originally, when people designed these, they used a function called the hyperbolic tangent that looks a lot like what you'd think the activation function of a neuron, a biological neuron, might look like, right? So there's some kind of inputs into this neuron that hardly activated at all, and then it reaches some kind of threshold at which it becomes very active, and then eventually it saturates. So this is a semi-saturating activation function. But this activation function is a little complicated, and so what people have used a lot in the literature on deep learning is an activation function called rectified linear unit. So this is a rectified linear unit. You'll notice that it also has a threshold, but there's no saturation. The idea behind this rectified linear unit is that if the activity is in the unit is negative, then we set the output of that unit to 0. So if for any activity below 0, we set the output to 0, and then for any activity above 0, we simply pass the activity through. So above 0, the function is y equals x. It's simply a linear function with a slope of 1. And that's implemented here in this code. We take the maximum of the input x and zeros. So if the x is larger than 0, we pass x. If x is smaller than 0, we pass 0. Let's implement that into our neural network. So now we take the dot product in every unit, and we pass it through this rectified linear unit. We find a maximum between the output and the number 0, and we run that through our entire network, and we get the output of the network. In this case, that is 12. Notice that the activity, the output has changed because of this. Previously, the output was 4, and now the output is 12. So this kind of nonlinear activation function does change the way in which the network operates. Okay, as I told you before, the goal of training the neural network now is to find the value of the weights that best does the task that we're interested in. And we do this through a process called backpropagation. The idea is we propagate error through the network back to calculate a gradient or a derivative for each weight. So for each weight, we multiply 3 numbers in order to see how we should change that weight in every iteration through the algorithm. First of all, we ask, what is the gradient of the loss function with respect to the node that a weight feeds into? Second, we ask, what is the value of the node that feeds into the weight? How much activity came into this weight? And then finally, we ask, what is the slope of the activation function of the node it feeds into? So the idea here is to ask, how much will the error change if we change the activity of the node that we're feeding the weight into? So for example, for the network that we had above, this network that I described here, let's assume that we initialized the weights with some values and we got 12, but let's say that for this particular set of inputs that we've provided here, we want an output of 10 instead of 12. So there's some error. The error here at the very top, take here the simplest possible error, which is the absolute difference, or the difference between the output of the network x31 and the desired output. The desired output here is 10. We know that the true value that we should get here is 10, but the network gave us instead 12. So the error that we call error 31, the error of the output unit, is this difference. Now, the slope of the activation function in every node is the derivative of the activation function of that unit. And for every unit here, we had the activation function set to the rectified linear unit, or ReLU. And so we wrote a little helper function here that finds the derivative of the rectified linear unit. The derivative of the rectified linear is actually quite simple. If the input is larger than 0, then the derivative is 1. That is, the slope above 0 is 1. And then the slope below 0, the function is flat, so the derivative is 0. And so this derivative is quite simple. It's 1 for values above 1, and it's 0 for values that are 0 or lower. And so here we're backpropagating the error. The idea is we had the error 31. We got that from the output relative to the desired output. And now we're calculating the error for the weight 311. So the error or derivative, the change that we should institute in 311 is equal to the error at the very top times the value of the node feeding into this weight, x21, times the derivative of the activation function, x31. The same is true for E321, the change in the weight 321. We take the error at the very top, 321. We multiply that by x22, which is the weight feeding, the activity of the node feeding into this weight. And then we have the derivative of the activation function of the node that the weight feeds into. Now, having calculated the errors for 311 and 321, we can propagate those errors further back in the network. So we're propagating the errors down from here to these previous weights. Do that in the next couple of lines. The error in the weight for the weight 211. So now we're computing the errors for the hidden layer, for the weights into the hidden layer. E211 is equals to the error here that we're propagating back, E311 times, again, the activity in the unit that feeds into this. This is x11 times the derivative of the activation function of unit x21. And we should do the same for all the weights in the hidden layer. So we have 4 weights in the hidden layer, and each one of them has this error. Now, in order to implement gradient descent, we implement a very small learning rate. This learning rate sets how much we're going to change the weights in every iteration through the algorithm. So we set a learning rate to some small number, and we adjust the weights. So weight 311 is equal to its value originally, minus the error computed for that weight times that learning rate. And we apply the same kind of idea to every one of the weights in the network. You go through and compute that, and then we again compute the values of the activity in every node, and we repeat this process again. So now we can look at the value of the activity in the network. So it changed from 12 to 10.5. So we're closer to our objective. Our objective was for the activity to be 10. We're closer to that objective, but we can repeat that again. So we calculate again the error here, backpropagate the error through the weights in the network, and compute the change in the weights, and then now the value of the activity is 10.1, so we're ever closer, and we can repeat that again, and now the value is 10.06, so really much closer, and maybe if we repeat this one more time, we'll see that there more or less starts to converge. We're really, really close now, 10.02. And so we're really, really close. And maybe we decide that this is the point at which maybe when the error goes below 0.00 or 0.01, then we decide that we can stop, and we decide to settle on these weights. So this is the process of backpropagation. Now I've written this in very simple code here so that you can see every piece of the mechanics. But the truth is that we don't want to write these networks in such detail every time that we're doing deep learning. And so we're going to use a deep learning library called Keras in order to do these computations in what follows. So Keras does all of these things for us. It builds the networks for us, and it implements the process of backpropagation for us. And so we don't have to write all these networks in detail, hook up our networks in detail. Instead, Keras takes care of that for us. So let me introduce that. I'll use the scikit-learn library in order to generate some simple data sets. So I'm creating some very simple data sets. The data set that I'm creating here, we've created some training data, 1,000 samples of training data, and 1,000 samples of training labels. The idea behind this data set, let's say that we have 1,000 rows in this data set, and each one has 2 columns. Let's think of this as a very simple image with only 2 pixels. So 2 pixels in this image, and the value in the first column here, in the training data, the value in this first column is the intensity of the pixel, the first pixel, and then the value in the second column, the intensity in the second pixel, and each row here is a different image. And let's say that we want to decide whether these images are images of a cat or a dog. It's a 2-pixel image, so it's kind of hard to see. But let's say that we have labels for each one of these. So we have 10 rows from this data set of 1,000 rows here that we're showing. And the way we've encoded that is through a one-hot encoding. The idea behind a one-hot encoding is that each row has 2 items in it. One is the cat item, and the other is the dog item, and only one of them is set to 1, and the other is set to 0. For example, here, the first item is set to 1, so maybe this image up here, we think of this as a cat image, and then this is also a cat image, the second image. But the third image has a 0 in the first item and a 1 in the second item, so we think of this as a dog. So the first column here represents cats, the second column represents dogs. So whenever the first column is set to 1, we think of this as a cat image. Whenever the second column is set to 1, we think of this as a dog image. And you'll notice that only one of the columns can never be set to 1. That's why it's a one-hot encoding. Only one is set to 1, and the other is always set to 0. And we can visualize this. So let's visualize the training data here. What you'll see here is that the data here we've set the data, we've plotted it out on a 2-dimensional surface. The value of the x-axis here is the value of the pixel in the value of the intensity in the first pixel, and then the y-axis is the value of the intensity in the second pixel. And we've colored those in so that yellow is cats and blue is dogs. And so we can see that the data is intermingled to some degree, but you could still maybe draw a straight line through this to separate between them. So let's try to train a neural network to do this discrimination, to discriminate cats from dogs. We'll use the Keras library down here. We're going to import from the submodule keras.models, we're going to import the sequential model object. And then from keras.layers, we're going to import the dense layer. The idea here is we're connecting densely connected layers. That means that every unit in every layer connects to every unit in the subsequent layer. Let's build first a very, very simple network. So we start by initializing a sequential object. The sequential object will be our neural network. And the way that Keras works is the model object, once you've initialized it, it has the add method. In the add method, you add additional layers into the network, and you can add many, many layers, but here we're going to add only 2 layers. The first layer here is our input layer into the network, and this input layer will have 32 units. So these 32 units receive their inputs from the image. Their input shape then is the shape of the training data. So this is train data.shape in -1 is 2. So these are the 2 pixels. So there are 32 units in this densely connected layer, and every one of these 32 units receives an input from every one of the pixels. So the idea is now that in this layer, there are 32 units and 2 weights per unit. So that's a sum of 64 weights feeding into this input layer. We've set the activation function to be a rectified linear unit. And we're adding also an output unit or an output layer. This output layer has only 2 units in it, 1 unit for cats and 1 unit for dogs. In this kind of classification task, we want a unit that tells us whether this is a cat and another unit that tells us whether this is a dog. The output unit has a so-called softmax activation function. I'll show you what that means in just a minute. Once a model object has been initialized, then all the components of the network have been added, all the layers have been added, we compile the network. Keras requires us to compile the network in order to start the fitting. In order to compile the network, we need to tell the network what kind of loss function we'll use, and we need to give it some additional parameters, like what kind of optimizer to use under the hood and what metrics we'd like to look at as we're training the network. This loss function, categorical cross entropy, is a loss function that we use for these kinds of classification tasks. So we compile the network, and once the network is compiled, we can fit it. So we give it the training data, we give it training labels, we tell it how many epochs we'd like to train for, and how many data items to use in every batch. So you'll remember that I told you before that in stochastic gradient descent, we give the network a batch of data in every iteration. So in every iteration, we're going to give it just 100 samples, and those 100 samples will be used to do backpropagation. And then we'll repeat the process. We'll give it another batch of another 100 samples. And we'll go through the data 5 times. So we'll go through giving it 100 samples in every iteration. We'll go through the entire data once, and then we'll repeat that process again. We'll give it 100 samples each time, and we'll repeat that process 5 times. And that's called epochs, how many times we go through the entire data set. Now, in addition to telling it how many epochs we're going to go through and what the batch size is going to be in every iteration, we also ask it to keep aside a certain amount of the training data for validation. So in every time we go through the entire data set, we're going to test on a set of data that we've kept aside of 20% that wasn't used for backpropagation. It wasn't used to train the network. And we're going to check how well the network is doing in this epoch on this validation subset. And in this case, we're setting that to 20%. Okay, so we're running the fitting right now, and that will go now, and it's training on 800 samples and validating on 200 samples. And you can see that this went through quite quickly and went through 5 epochs of this. And in the end, it ended up with validation accuracy of 0.64. And that's how well it can do, given how intermingled the two classes are in this case. So in the end, as I told you before, once we've trained the network, we want to make sure that the network is not overfit to noise. So we're going to test it on separate test data. So when I created the data set up here, I created both a training data set and a test data set. And I've set aside this, this test data set until now. And now I'm going to call model.evaluate to see how well the model does once we're done fitting. So I do that. And then I'm going to print out what the accuracy is. So the accuracy of this network is not that great. It's about 0.6. And I can use the model also to predict on this test data. So my prediction is, looks like my one hot encoding. It's for every item in the test data, it tells me whether it thinks this is a dog in this case or a cat in this case. And we can plot that as well. Here, this is the prediction on the test data set. You'll see that in this case, it didn't do that great. Let me generate another random data set. So I'll repeat some of the things that I did before, and I'm just going to make sure. In this case, the data is much less intermingled, and so the network has a much better chance of doing a good job. I'll repeat this step here that initializes the model, and I'll fit it to this new training data that I've generated. In this case, you can see that the validation accuracy is much higher. And also in testing, the accuracy is much higher. It's much closer to 0.9. Now, when we do the prediction and plot the prediction, you can see that the model has created a separating line between parts of the data that it thinks is dogs and parts that it thinks is cats. Now, I've added additional examples here of data sets that are not linearly separable. For example, in this data set, there's no straight line that you could draw through this space that would separate the yellow cat points from the blue dog points. And in this case, a neural network of this kind with just one layer doesn't work that well. This is what I show here in this fitting of this network that I showed you before. It's pretty limited in how well it can do. But skipping forward, what I'll show you here is that you can create a network that has a few more layers. So in this case, I've taken the network that I created before, and I add one more densely connected layer here in the middle. So there's this input layer here, add another layer here that adds one more densely connected layer, another layer of 32 units, also with an activation function of a rectified linear unit, and then this output unit of densely connected layer with just two, one for the cats and one for the dogs. I also compile this one, and I train this network and then immediately evaluate it. And this network does much, much better at this very hard classification task where the two categories are not linearly separable. So when we predict, we get a prediction surface that really incorporates this complexity of the original data. Okay, I'd like to move forward a little bit quickly here now in order to show you how this we can incorporate this into our work with some brain data. So as I mentioned in the paper that we recently published, we trained a neural network to accurately discriminate between high quality and low quality brain T1 weighted images from the healthy brain network data set. Here in this example, we're going to do a slightly simpler task. Imagine that instead of a full data set of T1 weighted images with high quality and low quality data, you have a data set of brain sagittal slices. And in some images, the subjects are facing to the left. And excuse me, in some other images, the subjects are facing to the right. And you'd like to build a neural network that will discriminate those. So let's first get the data. I'm going to download the data here. This will take a short while. And you can do this in your notebook as well. Okay, so once the data is downloaded, we're going to load in the data into our notebook and look at it. So we have some training data, we have some test data, we have labels that tell us whether each image in the training data set is turning to the left or to the right, and we have some test labels for the test data. So let's look at this data. We're going to look at the very first item. Here, you can see this is a sagittal slice, and this sagittal slice is oriented turning to the right. In this other image here, in the second image in the data set, the brain is turning to the left. So we have this big set, and has some of them are turning to the right, some of them are turning to the left, and we'd like to build a neural network that knows how to discriminate between those two cases. Okay, let's look at the size of the data. So we have 944 training samples. Each sample is an image with 256 by 256 pixels. And there's only one channel because this is grayscale. And we have, accordingly, labels, 944 labels. In this case, the labels are not one-hot encoded. Instead, showing you the train labels. The training labels in this case are zeros and ones. So zeros for turning to the left, zeros for turning to the right, and ones for turning to the left. And Keras knows how to incorporate this, and it knows how to incorporate one-hot encoded labels, as I showed you in the previous example. For the test data, we have 236 samples. These are all each images with 256 by 256 pixels, and we have the appropriate labels for the test data as well. Okay, so again, we're going to use Keras to do this. We're going to use the toCategorical function from the Keras utils in order to take our training labels here and turn them into something that looks like this instead, right? The one-hot encoding that I showed you before. So Keras lets us take a categorically encoded set of labels like this, zeros and ones, or ones and twos, or ones and threes, and it turns it into the one-hot encoding that we need for the Keras network. We're also going to take the training data, the images, and we're going to flatten them. So we're going to reshape every image into one long vector. So for our initial attempt at classifying this, we're going to use a densely connected network. And densely connected networks take every pixel as an item in a long vector. So this is done by reshaping the data into a flat array. The flat array has in every row 256 by 256 pixels. So you can see here what we get here is the original training data was 904 by 256 by 256 by 1, but now the trained data flat shape is 944 by 65,536, which is for every item 256 by 256. So we flattened out every image into a long string of numbers instead. Okay, we go here to create a densely connected network. It's very similar to the network that we used before. We have we have this input layer here that takes as input, when we initialize it, it takes this number 65,536 to define the input shape. It has 32 units and a ReLU activation function. As before, we have a hidden layer. This also has 32 units. It's also densely connected, so it receives an input from every one of the units in the first layer. And it also has an activation function of a ReLU. And then we add a densely connected output layer with 2 units, and this one has a softmax activation function. We compile that, and then we go ahead and fit that. And this goes through 10 epochs with a batch size of 100 and validation split of 0.2. And you can see that you can train a neural network to do this that does really, really well at doing this. So there's enough information here to train a densely connected neural network that does really well. But in the next little bit, what I'd like to introduce to you is the idea of convolutions and how we use convolutions in neural networks. So let's go into a little bit of more deeper into what convolutions are before we incorporate convolutions into our neural networks. So here are convolutions. I'm going to use this plot with annotation function in order to demonstrate what a convolution is with some images. So let's look at a simple image. So this is an image with 4 rows and 5 columns. So it's a 4x5 little image. And I've written into every pixel here the value, the grayscale value of that pixel. So brighter parts here are lower values and darker parts are higher values. And you can see that this image goes from 0 up to 10 and then down back to 1. So it's fairly simple image. I'm going to 0 pad this image around. So now I have my original image here in the center, and then I've added zeros around. And for the purpose of the convolution, I'm going to create a convolution kernel. Here's my convolution kernel. It's a 3x3 kernel that has 1s going through the middle row and middle column, and then it has zeros in the corner. And in a convolution, what we do is that we take this kernel and we pass it over this image. We pass it over the image that we're interested in convolving. So what I start by doing is I initialize a result, the result of the convolution, the feature map that I will create in this convolution is an image of the shape of this original small image. And then what I do is in every iteration through the convolution, I'm going to take the part of the image that I'm convolving. In this case, it's this corner up here. I'm going to multiply it by the convolution kernel, and I'm going to sum the multiplication altogether. So I'm multiplying the image by the kernel, and then I'm summing up that, and I'm adding that into the pixel in result 1, 1. So this is the result of the convolution in this top left corner will be put into the pixel equivalent to this pixel. So let's look at that. So I've convolved the top left corner of this 0 padded image, and I put that result in this pixel here. Next, I'm going to move the filter by 1, and I'm going to convolve the kernel with these 9 pixels up here and put that into the next pixel. So you can see I've started, this is the first operation, and now this is the second operation. And I keep going and sliding the kernel over the image, and in every pixel, I put the result of the convolution into this central pixel. Here in this cell, I'm going to repeat this operation multiple times in order to convolve over all of the pixels. So now I've gone through and I've run this convolution kernel over all the pixels in the image, all the locations and all the 3x3 locations in the image. And in every 3x3 location, I multiply and sum and put that into the result. And so I get this kind of convolved image in the end. Let's look at the convolution of this kernel with our training data. So here is, I've taken the first image in our training data. This is what this image looks like. And now I take my convolution kernel that I've created here, this convolution kernel with the 1s running through the central column and the central row, and I convolve it here in this through with this image. And this is what this looks like when I've convolved. So what you'll see here is that when you convolve it with this kind of filter, you get a slight smoothing of the original image. Let's take a different convolution kernel. In this case, our convolution kernel is this kernel that has a vertical bar running through the central row. So this is a convolution kernel that is sensitive to horizontal orientations. Let's take our brain image and let's convolve this with the kernel that has this horizontal edge. what you can see here is that the resulting feature map emphasizes vertical edges in the original image and de-emphasizes, horizontal edges in this image, and de-emphasizes all the other features like vertical orientations. Let's do the same by rotating the kernel 90 degrees into this shape here. So now we have a kernel that's sensitive to vertical bars. Instead, we convolve that with the image, and we show the feature map that comes out of that. So you can see that now our feature map is emphasizing the vertical orientations in this case. So this is a convolution with the horizontal bar, and this is a convolution with a vertical bar. So why are these kinds of convolutions useful for neural networks? Well, they take advantage of the fact that the image contains spatial correlations on small scale. In the scale of 3 by 3, there's spatial correlations. If we can learn features of the image that are correlated at that scale, we can take advantage of that because we have to learn less weights. So because natural images contain correlations, we can reduce the number of parameters that we have to learn in the first few layers of the network. Instead of creating densely connected layers that have to learn about every single pixel in the image, we instead learn convolutional units that only learn about a little 3 by 3 box in the image, and then run this box over the entire image for us. Okay, so in order to create a convolutional neural network using Keras, we're going to include in this network a 2D convolutional unit. We're going to still have the densely connected units. We need a flatten operation that will take the images and flatten them for us. And we're going to incorporate into this also max pooling and dropout. These are additional operations that neural networks know how to do in order to improve the training. Okay, let's start by creating a really simple convolutional neural network. This convolutional neural network has in the first layer, it has conv2D units. It has 32 of these units. Each unit, in this case, instead of having a lot of weight for every pixel, it has only a kernel size of 3. So it has 3 by 3 weights. So each one of these 32 has only 9 parameters. The input shape in this case is the training data shape. So it's 256 by 256 by 1 channel. This has an activation function of the rectified linear unit. Then we pass that, we flatten the output of the convolutional layer into long vectors and pass that into a densely connected layer for our output. So this is a very simple convolutional neural network. It has one input layer and then an output layer. Again, 2 units because we only have 2 categories here, leftward facing, rightward facing. And this has a softmax activation for the output. We compile the network and then we fit it to the data. Sorry, I need to run this import operation first so that this cell works. And then I fit it. Run the fitting. Again, we have 10 epochs. Each batch is sized 100, and we left out a validation split of 0.2. You can see that the network converges and actually does a pretty good job in this. In this case, it converges on something 99, almost 99 or more than 99% accuracy. But let's make the network a little bit more complicated. So I told you that you can create these simple networks that have just a few layers, and it seems to work pretty well for our case. But in many cases, you'll want a slightly more complicated network. So let me just show you that you can create networks that are a lot more complicated. So this is a sequential model, and it has a convolutional input layer just as before. But now we're going to add batch normalization here. This is an operation that normalizes the outputs of previous layers. And then we're going to do some pooling and add another convolutional layer with number of filters times 2 here, and then repeat that. We add another max pooling and another convolution, another max pooling, another convolution, another max pooling, another convolution, and so on. And then in the end, we flatten that, and we, in this case, have a densely connected layer. We add one more densely connected layer of 128 units in here, and another one of 128. And then in the end, we add this output layer of that has only 2 units for the number of classes. So this is a really complicated network, or a much more complicated network than the one that we saw before, and it has multiple layers. And we're going to set a learning rate here, and we're going to use a custom optimizer. So you can see that the code is getting a little bit more complicated here because we're using a custom optimizer called the Atom optimizer, and we're going to set the learning rate to this learning rate. And then we compile that, swapping out the previous optimizer that we used for this custom optimizer that we used here. Okay, the summary operation here, the summary function here, tells us about this. This is quite useful because it tells us all about this network. So we can see that there's multiple convolutional layers here. There are multiple there's a batch normalization operation, pooling, convolution, pooling, convolution, pooling, convolution, densely connected layers up here. And then we use this algorithm called dropout in order to regularize the operation in the densely connected layer. And then in the end, the densely connected layer at the top. So this network is a lot more complicated than the networks that you've seen before, but it's all built out of the same building blocks that you saw before, layer upon layer upon layer. And now we have a deep learning network because this is why they're often called deep, because it has multiple layers. And this network has multiple parameters, more than 500,000 parameters. And it's very usual for us in this field to see models that have millions of parameters. And that's one of the reasons that you need a lot of data in order to train these networks. Let's go ahead and train this network. So we train this network, and it runs and crunches through our data here. You can see that initially it had quite a low accuracy, but it converges quite rapidly, and within just a few epochs, we have a model that has pretty high accuracy. Okay, now I won't show, but you can, of course, validate this by checking the accuracy against the test data that you had. I'll just show one more thing at the bottom here, and I'll show this quickly, but you can explore this on your own in the notebook as well, is that you can show the activations in the network. So using the code that I have here that I won't walk through in much detail, you can take your network, and you can show the activation of the network for a particular set of input data at different levels of the network. So we're going here layer by layer through the network, and we're showing the activation of these layers to this input. What you can see is that as we go through the network further and further into the network, we get more and more pooling in the network, and in the end we get these kinds of activations at higher levels of the network that are a lot more abstract than they were initially. Initially we have the convolutional features, initially at least, operate on very local and give us images that look a lot like the input images. But as we go through, we get things that are abstracting out where are the regions of brightness and darkness in the image. Okay, so to summarize, what you learned here is initially how the mechanics of backpropagation work, and then I'll walk you through a few examples of training neural networks with Keras, ending with this example of neural data. I hope that this is useful for you as you go forward into further lectures in this course. I hope that you enjoy the course, and I look forward to seeing you in person one day.